They involve the question of the use of torture. I am going to go over one particular case where they go over the use of torture in one particular session. But before we look at it, let me maybe read to you the idea of the approval of the use of torture by the magisterium in cases of the Inquisition. And and I want to remind y'all, for anybody who's just now tuning in, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button. So yes, the magisterium did approve the use of torture. It's now condemned that as recently as Dignitas infinita, which would be a document by Pope Francis in 2024. I'm sorry, it's Dignitas infinita from 2024, last year, a declaration on human dignity. So that's kind of been reversed. But yes, at one point, the magisterium approved the use of torture for the Inquisition. We're going to take a look at it. Not only that, though, and I think what's probably new information to you, and it certainly was new information to me, is that one particular pope, I'll show this to you in a moment, not only approved the use of torture, but he says, well, look, okay, mutilation is wrong, but if any of you inquisitors go ahead for whatever reason, you engage in mutilation, you're trying to extract by torture a confession of a heretic, you're trying to get that confession, and you engage in mutilation, you know what? I'm going to allow the inquisitors to absolve themselves. Yeah, that actually happened in a magisterial document. I'll show that to you in a moment. So the Pope basically says, mutilation is wrong, but if any of y'all do it, I'll let you absolve yourselves. Now think about that. That's like saying to a judge, as the president of the United States, kind of basically saying, all right, judges, y'all are not supposed to wrongfully convict people. But if you do wrongfully convict people intentionally, I'll allow you to get off the hook and not be held accountable for it. Well, that's going to be a recipe for disaster. You're going to have judges all the time wrongfully convicting people they just don't like, and they're off the hook for it because they get to absolve themselves. So yeah, this is pretty some wild stuff. Okay, let me show this to you because I come with receipts. In the first case, you do have the approval of torture being used in 1252 by Pope Innocent IV. In this particular document, which is ad extirpanda, to eradicate, this did not allow the inquisitors to use torture, but it allowed a layman to use torture on behalf of the inquisitor, who was usually a cleric. So the inquisitor would initiate it, would direct it, but it would be like a layman carrying it out. And that was approved of by Pope Innocent IV in 1252. Here you can actually see it in the document. I'll read to you an excerpt from the document. Law 26 from the Pope. The head of state or ruler must force all heretics, so force the heretics whom he has in custody, provided he does so without killing them or breaking their arms and legs. And so his stipulations are, you're to force, through the use of torture, extract a confession, but make sure you don't kill them or break their arms or legs. Why? Because they're actual robbers and murderers of souls and thieves of the sacraments of God and Christian faith. You force them to confess their errors. That's going to be, kind of problematic because it's assuming that they're guilty, right? But okay, to confess their errors and accuse other heretics whom they know, which a lot of times people did make accusations against others. Maybe if they had a vendetta against them, they would say, yeah, I heard so-and-so say that they denied the resurrection. I read this account of a 12-year-old poor girl. She's being grilled by this inquisitor. Yeah, this lady over here, she said that she saw you at the mill put your hand on a bag of flour and swear before God that the dead will not be raised bodily. Do you believe the resurrection? This poor little 12-year-old, she's like, I've never said this before. Of course I believe the resurrection. It's so sad, but it's ridiculous. But anyways, okay. and accuse other heretics whom they know, and specify their motives, and those whom they have seduced, and those who have lodged them and defended them as thieves and robbers. Notice that. Even those who are defending them. So you couldn't even come to their defense and say, actually, poor Judy over here didn't say that she denied the resurrection, because then you're suspected of being a heretic. As thieves and robbers of material goods are made to accuse their accomplices and confess the crimes they have committed. So they're being forced, they're extracting these confessions through the use of torture. This is a magisterial, official, papal document of the Pope, 1252, ad extrapundum. Okay. All right. But again, at this time, it's still restricted to, a layman has to do it on behalf of the inquisitor. But that changed under Pope, Urban IV in Ut Negocium, a 1264 rescript. I'm sorry, no. This was Alexander IV. Ut Negocium, the document itself is a rescript of Urban IV on the question of the use of torture. And what it notes is that not only can torture be used by the inquisitors, but the inquisitors, if they mutilate somebody, like go beyond the bounds of what the Pope said, don't break their limbs or whatever. Well, if you go beyond that, for whatever reason, no questions asked, another inquisitor can absolve you of that. So it allowed the inquisitors to absolve each other from any sentence of excommunication or irregularity. So they can't be excommunicated for mutilating someone, or for, they can't in any way be punished for any irregulations in these torture sessions. Okay, so just so you know, I come with receipts. Ut Negocium of Alexander IV. Here is a translation of the relevant section, and it took me forever to find it, so you are welcome. I did a lot of digging to find it, because you got numerous people quoting it, like secondhand. But here I'm going to give you an actual extract from it. So you don't have to take somebody's word that the Pope said it. You get to actually read in his own words what he said, because somebody might be like, well, what did the Pope say? Maybe he's being misunderstood or something, right? So here's on the book called Torture by Edward Peters, page 237, has a section from this bull. He says, in order to expedite the work of faith that you carry out, we authorize you by this permission, talking to the inquisitors, that if you incur in any cases the sentence of excommunication or irregularity, whether it should occur from human weakness. So, if you're torturing these people and you start mutilating them and going like really, really far, just because, maybe you were really angry at these people because they weren't giving you the confession. So human weakness, started to kick in, and you got really angry at this person because they weren't confessing that they're a heretic, and you start, sawing off their arm or something. Well, or if you should incur it later on because you're not able to have recourse to your superiors at the moment, you may absolve each other of these things according to the proper form of the church. And by this authority, you're enabled to dispense each other, just as this power has been conceded to your superiors by apostolic authority. So, you can very clearly see he's giving them license to mutilate people without saying, hey, you have permission to mutilate people. So it's this idea of mutilation is wrong, but if for any reason you go ahead and do it, you can basically forgive each other and you don't have to have any consequences for it. Well, that's effectively approving it while saying, well, technically I don't approve of it, but I'm going to let you guys do this. So it's an approval without saying it's an approval, right? And it's obviously incredibly corrupt, and is a recipe for even more corruption and more disaster. This is an official magisterial papal document of the Pope. Okay, so what exactly did they do? Well, without going into this in any kind of exhaustive way. Let's talk just a little bit about it. Some discourage the use of torture, some of these inquisitors. Other manuals, because a lot of these inquisitors had a manual to tell them kind of what to do, because they realized without a manual, I mean, these inquisitors were just going absolutely wild, doing whatever with no real kind of regulation to what they were doing. So they started coming up with these different manuals, and one of them, who came up with a popular manual in the 1300s, Nicholas Emerick, strongly recommends in this manual the use of torture. He describes it in detail, gives the rules that are to be followed in these torture sessions, and he considers it very, very praiseworthy. Now, what are some of the ways in which they tortured people? We're going to actually read a real account of this torture session, one of them. But to kind of introduce you to the idea, obviously this stuff is pretty dark and graphic, so maybe don't have children around. The strappado, the victim was lifted to the ceiling with his arms tied behind his back and then dropped violently, but without touching the ground. And so this obviously usually dislocated their arms. And so what would happen is, a lot of times these people, after these torture sessions, were disabled the rest of their lives. And so again, whether the person is innocent or not, they're trying to extract this confession on their part. The idea is that you only use this if it's like really, really certain that they're a heretic, like there's really strong evidence. That's kind of the way some people have tried to whitewash it, but that's not how it actually happened in reality in many cases. And in some cases, this was often used, and the Inquisition was often used for financial gain, because whenever one of these people were accused of being a heretic and maybe they were put to death, their property is then given over to, who do you think? Take a wild guess. Well, you guessed it. Okay, so sometimes people would abuse it. They would accuse people of being a heretic when they weren't, due to some vendetta, or they would do it for the sake of gaining property. There was all sorts of reasons. Well, anyways, so these people were often tortured and then didn't walk away from this in any kind of way in which they could function very well, as you could imagine here. Also, you had the rack. The prisoner was tied to a frame and the executioner pressed, but stopped before or if the meat was pierced or blood flowed. So they're pressing up against them. In another version, the victim was stretched on a sort of table, usually with serious impact in later life. And so many inquisitors believe the rack was not allowed, one source says. Waterboarding, the prisoner was tied, a cloth was inserted through his mouth, down his throat, and 1 liter jugs of water were poured in his mouth. The victim had the sensation of drowning, and the stomach swelled until nearly bursting. These are the ones that I can mention. The others I'm not even going to mention because they're so horrible. I can't even talk to you about them. All right. So moving on, obviously this is contradicted by, again, as I said, Dignitas infinita, which says this about the use of torture. Finally, it should be stated, even if someone has been seriously guilty or guilty of serious crimes, the practice of torture completely contradicts the dignity that is proper to every human being. So the church now condemns this, but at one point it not only allowed it, it even allowed for people to absolve each other in the use of this. For what purpose? To extract a confession from an accused heretic. Well, you can obviously see this is going to create a lot of problems, because why exactly are you trying to extract a confession from them through the use of torture? You know perfectly well that a lot of people are going to end up saying, fine, I'm a heretic, even though they aren't. They're going to say that when they're being tortured, right? Yeah. And in this torture session I'm going to read to you, one of the guys being tortured says that. He says, look, I'm not a heretic. I follow Jesus Christ. I follow all the teachings of the church. I accept all the dogmas. But you're going to continue to press me to say that I'm a heretic when I'm not. I'm not a heretic. And if you use torture on me, which they then do, even if I were to say I'm a heretic, that's only because you're using torture. What good is that for you? So it's not a real confession because I'm saying it under torture. One poor girl that I was reading in one of these torture sessions and one of these inquisitions was saying, I was told that even if I'm tortured, I had a priest who told me, even if I'm tortured, do not renounce the faith. Do not say that you're a heretic. Do not claim that which is not true, because Jesus himself was tortured. And when he was tortured, he didn't confess something that wasn't true. So you shouldn't either. In other words, the priest was telling her, hey, if you ever face the Inquisition, never admit that you're a heretic, because you're not. Don't tell them you're a heretic, because you would be lying. And Jesus didn't lie when he was being tortured. And if he didn't do it, you shouldn't do it either. And she tells that to the Inquisitor, saying, look, there's really just, what do you really want from me? This guy is saying, if you get a confession from me through the use of torture, it's not real anyway, because it was just through pressure. And this other one is saying, why do you want me to confess something that isn't true? I would then be doing what Jesus didn't do and failing to live up to his standards. So I can't do that. So you're going to have to do to me whatever you want. I'm not changing my position. Okay, so let's take a look at this particular session here. So the Lord Andreo wrote the Inquisitor, informing him trustworthy people had told him that among all those the Inquisitor had captured, there was only one Lombard. These were considered heretics. And so out of all the people, there was only one heretic. He advised him to attend to the dignity of his inquisitorial office. He advised him as a good friend to stick to the truth in carrying out his duties, because without it, neither human nor divine justice is justly performed. When the Inquisitor read Lord Andreo's letter, he was furious. So he's reading this letter telling him, hey, be right, be just with these people. Don't wrong them in your Inquisition sessions. Well, the Inquisitor was not happy with that. He's like, how dare you? And vengefully turned all his indignation and wrath on the poor brothers he currently held. Now, who are these brothers? Okay, so you had what's called spiritual Franciscans. It's a huge, huge controversy at the time, and it's related to the question of papal infallibility in some curious ways. A lot going on here, but you had this group of spiritual Franciscans. They go by other names also in historical documents, so you'll see different names as well. And they believed that not only was Jesus someone who lived a life of poverty and didn't own anything, but that even Franciscans should not own anything, and some felt that took a little too far. There can be some kind of ownership, and the Pope ended up condemning the spiritual Franciscans and their position, saying it's heretical. At first, they were defended by one pope, and then they were rejected, and it kind of brought up the question of papal infallibility. So that's why it's tied into the question. There was a huge controversy there. But anyways, they ended up being condemned. And so they were then heretics, and there were a lot of spiritual Franciscans. And so during the period of the Inquisition, these were people that were often targets of the Inquisition. So some of these guys who were hoping that they're going to be approved by the Pope, the spiritual Franciscans, they had been condemned, but they were hoping that another Pope would approve of their order. And one Pope was going to, but then he died right before he did it. And the next Pope, reversed the document that was being prepared. They were hoping that Rome would be lenient to them. And so in this transition period between popes, they go to this Inquisitor, hoping that things would change. The Inquisitor wasn't happy and ends up going off on them. So that's the spiritual, these are the poor brothers that are being referenced here. And he sent the men of that town who loved the poor brothers deeply a summons to appear before him in the city of Trevi after a certain number of days, with a fixed fine as penalty if they failed to appear. When they came on the appointed day, he had them shut up in an old cistern and kept them there for 5 days, with no more ventilation than if he had shut them up in a wine cask, not even letting them out to attend to the necessities of nature. So they couldn't even go out to use the bathroom. After 5 days, this new Dacian had a certain place in the city hastily prepared so they could be tortured by the executioners. So after having them in prison for 5 days, he then goes to torture them. But when he saw that the bishop and other principal people in the city took the spectacle of such men being tortured very poorly, the bishop wasn't cool with this, the people in the city weren't cool with it, he changed his mind and passing through Boiano, descended to the castle of Maginando, a remote place where with a lord vicious enough to conspire in his own evil plans. So he finally found a place where, he could torture these people and the people were okay with it. There he had the prisoners whom he had dragged along behind him in chains, who were exhausted by the trip, placed under heavy guard. The next day he visited them, and binding himself with a terrible oath said, "Unless you confess to me that you are heretics, may God do thus and so to me if I don't kill all of you right here with a variety of tortures and torments." So, that's that's the condition that you're in, basically. You either have to say that you're a heretic and then get killed, or don't say that you're a heretic and then be tortured and killed. That's the situation they're in. If, as I ask you, do confess to me that you do or did err in something or other, I'll give you a light penance and set you free immediately. Yeah, I'm sure. The brothers replied that he should not ask them to say something that wasn't true. Yeah, so one guy is saying, look, you're asking me to confess something that's not true. I'm not going to do that. Telling such a wicked lie would cause death to their souls and offense to God. In other words, you want me to lie and say I'm a heretic, but when I do that, that's a mortal sin, and that would destroy my soul, and that's an offense against God. I can't do that. The furious inquisitor selected one of them who seemed more fervent than the others and was a priest, and ordered that he be tortured. The torturer entered with his assistants and tied the prisoner's hands behind his back. Then he had him raised up by means of a pulley. Okay, so you remember that one where they raise you up, then drop you, and then it dislocates your arms. By means of a pulley attached to the roof of the house, which was very high, after the prisoners had hung there for an hour, the rope was suddenly released, which obviously, again, dislocates your arms. The idea was that, broken by the intense pain, he would be defeated and confess that he had once been a heretic. After he had been raised and suddenly dropped many times, they asked whether he would confess that he was or had been a heretic. He replied, "I'm a faithful and Christian Catholic, a Catholic Christian, always have been and always will be. If I said anything else to you, you shouldn't believe me, because I would only have said it to escape the torture. Let this be my perpetual confession to you, because it's the truth. Anything else would be a lie extorted by torture." Pretty well said. And again, shows the stupidity of using torture to get somebody to confess that they're a heretic. Driven out of his mind by anger, the inquisitor ordered that, dressed in a short tunic, the prisoner be put first in a bath of hot water, then cold. Then, with a stone tied to his feet, he was raised up again, kept there for a while, and dropped again, and his shins were poked with reeds as sharp as swords. Again and again he was hauled up until, on the 13th elevation, the rope broke, and he fell with a great height with the stone still tied to his feet. So, when they put you really high and then drop you suddenly to dislocate you, they also tied a heavy stone to your feet so that when you dropped and then stopped you, it would rip you apart even easier and quicker. As that destroyer of the faithful stood looking at him, he lay there only half alive, with his body shattered. The treacherous man's servants took the body and disposed of it in a cesspool. That inquisitor, although he was a learned man of noble family, was so demented by fury that he began to inflict torture with his own hands. When one of the brothers who was struck by, or who was struck to be, sorry, when one of the brothers who was to be tortured devoutly recommended himself to Christ, he was so insane with anger that he struck the man on the head and neck. So one of the guys being tortured, basically says, "Into your hands I commend my spirit," and recommends himself to Christ. Well, that angered the inquisitor, and he began to beat him even more severely. He hit the man so hard that he drove him to the ground like a ball. For days afterward, the man's neck and head hurt, and his ears rang. Another brother had his head bound in the inquisitor's presence, and the binding was tightened until the torturers heard the bones in his head crack, after which they ended the torture and took him away for dead. So that's one of the devices where they put your head in this kind of rack thing and slowly close it to the point that it squishes your head. Okay, so obviously this is a very terrible situation. Not all inquisitors did this, by the way, right? This is just one account. Not all were like this. Some were more lenient than others. Some didn't use torture or use different kinds of torture, right? Different things were going on. But as we saw in the case of torture and mutilation, not only was the torture allowed and approved of by the Pope, but even more disturbingly, the inquisitors were given the authority to absolve each other of their sins whenever they mutilated people and transgressed the bounds that they were not to transgress. And so that's absolutely disturbing, because it's like saying this. Let me give you an example. Today, if you have a priest who sexually assaults a person, that priest, let's say the priest sleeps with a woman. Is he allowed to hear that woman's confession? Well, if that priest hears the woman's confession, he's actually automatically excommunicated. And rightly so, right? But it would be like saying this: okay, Mr. Priest, if you sleep with this person, I will allow you to not only hear their confession, but I'll allow you to absolve yourself so that you don't have to go and face any accountability to your bishop. And so you can basically sleep with this person and then forgive yourself for your sins, and you don't have to accept any responsibility. That's analogous to kind of what the popes were doing here with the keys of the kingdom and their magisterium. Horrible thing. Obviously, that has been overturned for whatever that's worth. It's a really wild situation. What's I guess most disappointing is that you know that stuff like that goes on, right? But it's unfortunate when you see the magisterium and the use of the keys of the kingdom being used to support this stuff, not only in approving torture, but also in allowing the people who mutilate people and torture people to get off the hook by absolving each other. It's absolutely disgusting and horrifying to see the keys of the kingdom, the use of the magisterium used for that. It would be, again, like using the magisterium for, a pope coming out and saying, any of you priests who abuse boys, I'm going to allow you to absolve your own self of your sins so that you don't have to admit what you did to anyone else and nobody has to know. That would be what it's like. It's that horrifying. It's that terrible. It's that disgusting. It's that disordered use of the magisterium to see that. And again, the magisterium now has overturned that and said that that's wrong. And you have popes who have apologized for it. But, the damage was done. The deed was done. The damage was done. And, it is what it is. It's truly sad to see that.